Hello and welcome everyone to today's critical conversation. My name's Hayaatun Sillem and I'm the CEO at the Royal Academy of Engineering and the Queen Elizabeth Prize for Engineering Foundation. Our overarching goal at the Royal Academy of Engineering is to harness the power of engineering to build a sustainable society and an inclusive economy that works for everyone. And we've been using these critical conversations to look at some of the engineering challenges and opportunities that are going to be crucial to addressing this goal. Today's event is the third and final event in the mini-series of critical conversations that we've been holding on conquering complexity through systems approaches. And in this session, we'll be exploring the governance of complex systems, using the rapidly growing offshore wind sector as an example. Governance plays a pivotal role in shaping how we respond to complexity. Yet traditional approaches can sometimes fall short in the face of interconnected, adaptive, multidimensional systems. And this means that in this increasingly complex world we find ourselves in, it's timely to look at how we can evolve our governance from perhaps more rigid top-down models to more dynamic, inclusive, responsive approaches that can in turn deliver safety and equitable outcomes and greater resilience. A really interesting sector where we can explore how this works in practice is offshore wind. It's a sector which is playing an increasingly important role in helping us reach our sustainability targets, as well as securing energy supplies. The governance of offshore wind presents some unique challenges, from ensuring the protection of marine ecosystems to managing technological advancements and addressing safety and environmental risks. And there are a really wide and diverse range of stakeholders involved, from government bodies to environmental groups to private industry and, of course, local communities. Over the past 5 years or so, Engineering X, which the Academy co-founded with the Lloyd's Register Foundation, has been working with partners across a range of those communities to ensure that systems thinking principles are embedded in real-world decision-making, including in offshore wind. So today we'll be diving into some of our learnings about how systems thinking can improve governance in the offshore wind sector so that we can ensure that offshore wind infrastructure remains safe, sustainable and effective for the long term. And I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by three fantastic experts for this session. First up, we have Professor Deborah Greaves, who's a Professor of Ocean Engineering and Head of the School of Engineering, Computing and Mathematics at the University of Plymouth, as well as being a Fellow of the Royal Academy of Engineering. We have Dr. Louis Klein, who's also the Dean at the European School of Governance, and Han Nguyen, Oceans Industries Lead at the World Economic Forum. So we've got a great set of panellists who are going to guide us through this topic. And I'm going to ask them each to introduce themselves briefly and to just explain a little bit about their area of expertise. So Deborah, can I turn to you first, please?
Thank you very much. And thank you for the invitation to take part in this discussion today. So I'm a Professor of Ocean Engineering here at the University of Plymouth, and I lead the Research Centre for Decarbonisation and Offshore Renewable Energy. I also am Director of the Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council funded Supergen Offshore Renewable Energy Hub. So this is a large programme of research across the UK that brings together academic research to work closely with industry and with policy. So I've been running that particular hub since 2018 with a large investment from EPSRC. So my background really is in engineering, in wave structure interactions, and over the last 18 years or so, very much in offshore renewable energy.
Fantastic, Deborah. Well, we're looking forward to tapping into that expertise. Louis, would you like to introduce yourself next, please?
Thank you so very much for having me. Yes, sure. I would just start as an economist and social scientist, but in the core, I'm a system scientist, cybernetician or social cybernetician, wearing two institutional hats. One, you introduced that already, being Dean of the European School of Governance. That is a think tank that looks into systems change, transformation, governance, and the like, on the small and the large scale. I'm also Secretary General of the International Federation for Systems Research, which is a peak body that convenes system thinking and practice worldwide in the different scientific institutions and the different practice institutions having a bit more than 40 institutional members representing a bit more than 26,000 system thinkers and practitioners. And this is very much where we look, how can we meet the challenges of our time, the polycrisis and the like with systemic response ability.
Thank you very much, Louis. And of course, we can't do systems approaches without drawing on different disciplines. So great to have you on board today. And Han, would you introduce yourself, please, as well?
Thank you very much. And it's a privilege and a pleasure to be here together with you and Deborah and Louis. My name is Han Nguyen. I'm the Oceans Industries Lead for the Ocean Action Agenda of the World Economic Forum, based in Geneva, Switzerland. So in this capacity, I work with business leaders across marine sectors such as offshore energy, so particularly offshore wind, what we're talking about today, ports and harbors, shipping, tourism, etc., to support the transition towards a nature-positive economy. I also help mobilize public and private partnerships to strengthen ocean stewardship. So very looking forward to the conversation later today. Thank you.
Thank you, Han. You're most welcome as well. So you can see we've got a great mix of expertise today to draw on. But I think we should start with making sure we've got the basics right. So Louis, I'm going to turn to you to just take us through, what do we mean by complex? What do we mean by governance? And how is the governance of a complex system different to a simple system?
Right. I'll probably just jump right into the middle, saying complexity is not the culprit. We've seen that over the last 10, 20 years, that whenever project management was challenged, whenever plans didn't come together, we addressed complexity as the culprit. As in a scenario where we wanted to go from A to B, given resources, milestones, and the like, which lays out a very narrow corridor, which, well, as much as we look into the built environment, that is the way to go. But as soon as we acknowledge that we are in an interconnected and interdependent world, there's a lot of things around it that sort of threaten that corridor. And this is where we're challenged. Complexity is inescapable. However, it is a very basic insight, a very basic acknowledgement that we are looking into feedback. We can think linearity from A to B to C, the arrows, like in project management, pointing in one direction. But as soon as A affects B, but B affects A in return, we are in a feedback loop. And this is where complexity resides. In the built environment, that is more the exception. But as soon as we look into the social environment, that is the rule. Whatever I say in the conversation will affect you in your response, which will affect me in turn. So mapping out, dealing with stakeholder interests is per se a complex issue. So this is where we need to be very mindful how we use the word complexity in contrast to complicatedness. We can think of all kinds of complicated engineering challenges, but they have a solution. Not so in the complexity. And I think I leave it here for the sake of brevity and picking it up later.
Thank you, Louis. Maybe just a very quick definition of governance.
Well, if we go to the governance, we can go to the etymology, and then we are back in the ancient Greek, where the gubernatus was the steersman. So our idea of governance is very much informed by the idea of navigation to get from A to B. In contrast to that, for example, in the Arabic word, hakama is what they use to address governance, but the root, the HKM, is the same like in hikmah, wisdom. So there, the idea of governance very much more relates to the idea of wisdom. And if we look at governance, well, it's navigation with wisdom. I think that is something that helps us around the issue is that it is not something that we could just calculate like the cause of a ship or an airplane, but there's so much more to it, and a rich field to explore.
I love that. Navigation with wisdom and a little tutorial on etymology along the way. Thank you very much. We're going to be taking audience questions later on, so at any time, if you've got a question that comes to mind, please do drop it into the chat and we'll look forward to picking it up in a few minutes. I'm just going to spend a little bit more time first with the panel, making sure that we've had the opportunity to just give a bit of an overview of this topic. And so, Han, I'd like to turn to you now, please. So from a multilateral perspective, what do you see when you look at governance in the offshore wind sector? Who's part of that? Who's involved, and why is it challenging?
Thank you. So I think first of all, it's very necessary to mention that offshore wind, it is a complex system, but it's also a key climate solution, right? So it's really about using the power of ocean to create clean energy and then helping reduce carbon emissions, fight climate change. And this is an industry that is growing very quickly. Thanks to new technology, more investment, it is now one of the fastest growing ocean-based industries. And as this growth continues, it's important to consider the complex system that Louis just referred to around the sector, and also make sure that it delivers positive results, not only for businesses, but also for people, for nature, for the communities. So there's a wide range of stakeholders that involved in the offshore wind sector. First and foremost, of course, we have to talk about the renewable energy companies, who specifically the offshore wind developers who lead the development, the construction, the operation, maintenance, and also eventual decommissioning of offshore wind farms and related infrastructure. And then supporting them, you can think of a very broad supply chain, including, for example, wind turbine manufacturers, logistic and transport providers, cable and grid connection installers, to help ensure that the electricity that is generated by offshore wind farm will be delivered to homes and industries. So within these kind of actors and industries, the offshore wind farm must really balance commercial viability together with safety standards as well as environmental concerns. Governing bodies plays a very crucial role in granting permits, establishing auctions for offshore wind farms, and also guiding the selection of what would be the site on which an offshore wind farm can be built based on wind resources, but also based on community inputs, environmental sensitivities, etc. Then we have like a number of organizations, such as environmental organizations, human rights organizations, who contribute to promoting the sector growth, but in a way that safeguards marine ecosystems, making sure that the operations minimize harms on birds, marine mammals, on the overall biodiversity. And then there are also social advocacy groups that have a role in pushing for more like inclusive participation of the communities around the areas that are affected or that are impacted, and create more jobs for that local areas, for example. And then maybe the last one I would mention is that as offshore wind expands, it will increasingly intercept with a lot of ocean space with other marine industries. So fisheries could be one industry that could be interacting with offshore wind sector. So it's very important to also consider and incorporate the interests of the coastal maritime communities that are involved in these sectors into the picture for this particular sector. And then finally, I think this may not be mentioned a lot when we consider the stakeholders, but I think financial institutions and investors also play a very key role, because their investment decisions will significantly influence the adoption of sustainable practices and considerations in the offshore wind sectors. So yeah, I hope that you get an overview of the sector as well as the different stakeholders with different interests and the complexity, of course, that are present in this fast-growing industry.
Thank you, Han. I think that does give us a really good sense of the sheer breadth of interfaces and stakeholders who are either enabling the sector or being impacted by it, both positively and negatively. That's very helpful. So now I'm going to turn to you, Deborah, for the engineer's perspective. So what makes offshore wind complex from a technical perspective, from an engineering viewpoint?
Okay, thank you. Well, I think a lot of the complexity for the infrastructure is the interfaces that Han's been talking about. But in terms of the design of the structures and how they operate themselves, it's complex because you're working in an offshore environment. So you need to design something that's going to be able to survive in wave conditions and also wind loading, so wind and wave together. It needs to be operating under those combined actions, and those create dynamic loading with different frequencies. So the structure needs to be able to survive those, and the structure is a coupled system. So you've got the turbine with the blades, you've got the tower, the connecting parts, and then you've got the foundation and the interaction with the soil and the structure through the foundation. So the whole thing is a complex coupled system, which is being excited by complex offshore environmental loadings, so wave and wind loading. And of course, a offshore wind farm is going to be spread across a large area because you need to separate the wind turbines themselves to give them space to recover the wind. So that means that the soil conditions might change as well. So although you're building multiple of these structures, then it may be that you need to adapt the design to suit different locations within your site. So that's the sort of a simple description of the structure. Then we need to think about how to install and operate and maintain the structure. So the new vessels and technology for getting people and equipment on and off onto these platforms offshore is an engineering design challenge and a potential safety issue. And then we've got the interaction with the environment, the use of the space, other marine users, and designing to enhance nature or to try to minimize the impact on nature. And then the interaction with the energy system. So interacting with the grid, and that means also the physical connection. So how do we get the electricity to shore through a cable? How do we connect that through the seabed to shore into the grid? But also, how does the energy that's produced, how does that interact and integrate with the grid system? So we need to think about the fact that renewable energy is of course variable. So we may need to have some storage into the system as well to create or to make sure that we have energy security and we have the electricity when we need it. But of course, another key part of the system is the user, the demand side, and how the energy market might be adapted and might modify in the future, and how that might also affect the infrastructure that we need to support it. So it's a very complicated, interconnected space. And then I'll just also add that most of what I've been talking about and what we have in terms of installed capacity for offshore wind in the UK at the moment is fixed bottom offshore wind. So it's the turbine going into the seabed through a monopile or a jacket type structure. But of course, we're now looking to exploit areas further offshore and in deeper water. And so we need to come up with more innovation, different solutions, different infrastructure solutions. So this may be deeper water, fixed, there may be articulated solutions, or they may well be floating offshore wind. So there's been a lot of research and innovation and development around floating offshore wind, which is at present, significantly more expensive, of course, than more costly than fixed offshore wind. So the other aspect is the finances and how we can generate that cost reduction through the development of the new technology.
Great, thank you, Deborah. So we've got this multi-layered, highly interconnected technological system that's also evolving. And so thinking about that evolution, we're seeing a high growth rate in offshore wind at the moment. How from an engineering perspective and from your professional experience, do you see governance working in terms of balancing those different objectives around ocean health and sustainability, the safety of those involved, and then, as you've referenced, the economics? What does it look like from your perspective in terms of how we can integrate those different objectives into the governance?
Yes, well, it is challenging, of course. Within the Supergen, we recently launched our 2040 Outlook report, where we tried to look at, what are we on track to get to net zero by 2050 if we use 2040 as a time frame to focus on. And that's helped us to think about, in terms of that question of the growth and the significant growth that we need to see whether we are on track. And we reckon that by 2040, we'll need to have 7 times more capacity than we have installed at the moment. We also need to do that 4 times faster. So we need to address the timescale for project development, including the consenting and planning permissions. And we also need 6 times more people in our workforce. So where are they going to come from, and how are we going to bring them into being part of the industry? So I think, with those sorts of accelerating numbers, it's going to be challenging. We also are aware, of course, that the marine environment is under pressure, and that we rely with biodiversity loss affecting habitats and so on, and that offshore wind or other developments, infrastructure in the marine space is going to also increase that pressure. And that the ocean health is extremely valuable to the planet and generates, about half of the oxygen we breathe. So, we need to protect, we need to look after our oceans. But of course, climate change has got the largest impact on ocean health. So finding solutions for climate change is also what we need to do. So that's that sort of tension or potential conflict between the targets for biodiversity and the targets for climate solutions. And that's why we need to think about integrating design for nature within our engineering solutions at an early stage in the design. And when we're looking at development of new spaces for offshore wind and other offshore renewable energies, then we need to do that in a maybe more of a strategic way, and be quite focused in thinking about the outcomes that we want to achieve in terms of energy security, but also in terms of healthy ocean, good outcomes for nature, but also good outcomes for social and economics, in particular in those communities that are going to be have potential to get real benefits from them. And of course, we could get to net zero without generating those benefits. So we need to build those into the strategy in developing offshore sites.
Thank you, Deborah. A really important set of issues raised then. And actually, Han, I know this connects very much with the work that you're doing. So could you tell us a bit about the Responsible Renewables Infrastructure Coalition, and also about how you're tackling some of those trade-offs and trying to seek inclusive outcomes through governance in the context of offshore wind? Thank you, Han. And just to say, hopefully we'll come to audience questions very soon. I just need to get through a couple more, and then hopefully we'll be able to dive into our audience questions. Thank you, Han.
Thank you. And I was nodding a lot when Deborah was mentioning, the benefits for communities and for nature from this climate solution as well. So it's exactly what we've been working over the past 2 years with the Responsible Renewables Infrastructure Coalition, which is a multi-stakeholder coalition that aims to accelerate the deployment of renewable energy in a way that benefits communities and nature. So to drive this vision forward, our initiative actually brings together some of the leading renewable energy companies with projects across different geographies, governments, financial institutions, as well as civil society organizations and academia, to really mainstream the adoption of responsible practices through public and private collaboration, and hopefully by that, deliver both business and societal value. So as an impartial convener, we really believe in fostering trust through dialogues. So we have a lot of conversations and meetings where representatives from different sectors can come together and understand the perspectives and realities from others. So just for example, in a lot of our meetings, offshore wind developers would hear directly from the experts with science-based inputs on nature and biodiversity considerations of energy infrastructures, or ways to promote inclusive governance and community engagement. At the same time, our NGO or academic members also gain insights on the practical challenges that businesses face on the ground when they try to integrate these approaches into the design and into the rolling out of offshore wind farms. So these are very open conversations to make sure that all of the perspectives are heard and individual concerns are addressed as well. We know that, of course, like not every company or every organization will be at the same level, right, of maturity when it comes to environmental readiness. But we worked together to find a common ground. So the common ground would be something that is ambitious enough to drive progress, but also realistic enough to get broader support from different stakeholders. Earlier this year, for example, we released the principles for responsible deployment of renewable energy. And so this principle was shaped by months of discussions between coalition members. And we really see that as a signal of like collective work in progress. It's going to be there on our website, and it's available for everyone to guide different stakeholders that I've just mentioned in the offshore wind sectors to really adopt these kind of practices for broader benefits. But we also not just producing principles, right? We also wanted to shine a light on what's working well already on the ground. So right now, we're actually gathering real-world examples from our coalition members to feature a number of case studies, a number of best-in-class projects that actually embody this principle and highlight exemplary government or business leadership in this sector. So that's how we have been convening the different members, the different representatives in this kind of complex governance systems, really to try to provide a space for different perspective. And finally, I also wanted to recognize that it's important, right, to flesh out the details at the working level, but it's also very critical to get buy-in from the leadership levels as well. So we also try as much as possible to provide a platform for leaders of the different organizations like CEOs of businesses or ministers, head of different organizations, head of communities to meet together and to also facilitate this public and private cooperation at the highest level to find the right balance in terms of the working level and the highest broad buy-in. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Han. And I think that point around these platforms for collaboration across sectors, across different types of stakeholder groups, where whether it's leaders connecting with each other or the opportunity to share, real world examples of what has worked, those are immensely valuable in the context of supporting better governance of complex systems. But I'm going to turn now to Louis. So Louis, I just wondered if there were any examples that you could share from other contexts, particularly around how you govern these technologies or sectors where you're getting this kind of rapid acceleration or rapid technological change. So when you're in that dynamic context, are there examples that you can think of which we should be drawing on when thinking about offshore wind? And while I've got you, I'm going to pose Sebastiano's question around wicked problems. So are there any particular pieces of guidance or wisdom that you can share around how we tackle wicked problems, I guess, from a governance perspective?
Thank you so very much for the question. Before I go into a concrete example, I would just land on one very crucial issue here. When we talk about offshore wind, we can talk about product, but we could also talk practice. And this is the way to approach complexity, to look at the practice and what regulates the practice, because this is where we catch complexity. This is where we meet it. This is where we can not only meet it to eliminate it, but to harvest it, to make it work our way. For me, the most radical insight, coming back to ocean health, was recognizing that the only really measurable activity that increased ocean health was not all the activism, was not all the filtering and the collecting of garbage, but were in fact fishing quota. So the practice of fishing, overfishing that came to it, look at it as a practice and agree on rules for that game collectively to say, these are the quota. This when we keep within these boundaries, the population of fish in the ocean has a possibility to regenerate. And this was massively stabilizing the situation, that as soon as you have rules of the game, they can be broken is on another page, but first get there. And when we go back to the engineering, but also taking care of everything around, and very much corresponding with Scott's laws of observation, who tell you that to any given topic, there's always more detail. There's always a bigger picture and always an alternative perspective, and making that key in the practice of meeting complexity to not only look into the detail, but always zoom out. And as soon as we do that, we see a lot of externalities. We touched upon that in terms of safety and health, environment, nature, challenging nature, caring, and all the lot, which are not sort of integral to the engineering process per se, however, very much affected by it. And if you widen the lens, those come into sight. And this is where I very much embrace what Hannah was introducing, the fostering trust through dialogue, which allows us not only to be in contact and to build the trust, but also to have those conversations out of which we can improve the rules of the game. As I would go as far as saying, catching complexity successfully is easiest with democratic structures, to invite people to come together, grow a shared understanding of the practice of what they're engaged in, made offshore, wind harvesting, or whatever in the realm, and agree on those rules of the game. And then we are back to the governance, which also in engineering terms, if we look at total quality management, has a lot to do with the processes we follow and the structures we give ourselves to keep our practice in a bandwidth that, if not only reduces the externalities, but also things in terms of resilience and regenerativity. Well, why are we not as bold as going as far as saying whatever we do in nature makes a difference, that makes a difference, and not only to say, oh, let's don't do harm, but also think about how can that actually increase in that precise field here, ocean health. And then it is almost jumps at us in the different practices we are involved, to say, how do we grow a shared understanding of it, and how do we agree on rules of the game that we share, that we are delighted to follow, to guide our own practice in a way that is resilient and regenerative.
Thank you, Louis. A great challenge. And I'm going to build out from there and turn to Simona's question, which, using your helpful kind of classification of product and practice, I think is on the product side. And I'm going to turn to you, Deborah. And so Simona's asking whether we can design devices that effectively, what we would call sort of follow nature positive engineering principles. So rather than just minimizing the harm, but actually make a positive contribution to ocean habitats. Deborah, is that realistic? What can we do there?
Yeah, I think we certainly can. We are, we're aware that the structure of the wind farm or other types of infrastructure can provide a sort of refuge for fish and for different marine animals, and can effectively, and also because of the fact that it impacts on the fishing activity in that site, will also potentially provide a nursery or effectively a protected area for biodiversity, so replenishing stocks. So just the very presence of it and the fact that it means that it's no longer going to be possible to trawl fish in that site will have an impact. But we can also think about how we design the structures themselves to enhance nature in different ways. One thing is the idea of co-location of aquaculture or other activities alongside offshore wind infrastructure. Another is to understand the impact of the design of the structure itself on the ecosystem, and that might be done through the physical interaction of a type of structure with the flows in the water column, with the waves, and how that affects mixing within the water column, and then that will have a knock-on effect on the ecosystem and how that develops. So yes, I think understanding better the interaction of individual structures is one thing which can have an impact, but also understanding the effect of the farm as a whole. So at different scales, we need to understand these interactions and impacts. And I think the other thing I would just say here is that although we've got quite a lot of offshore wind installed in the UK, we are, together with China, we're leading in terms of the installed capacity. We have plans to expand massively from there. So I've said 7 times capacity by 2040. Now, they won't all be the same size turbine, of course. But, this is just for the UK. The rest of the world is also targeting offshore wind and other offshore renewables as ways to transition. So there are huge plans to develop more of this. And so we absolutely need to understand the interaction, the potential impact, whether we can make that positive or negative. And we have very limited data to work from. So one thing I think is really important is to try to find ways to make sure that we're sharing the experience that we have from the infrastructure that already exists.
Thank you so much, Deborah. Now we're accumulating questions, so I'm going to ask people to keep their answers short so we can try and get through as many as possible. And Han, I'm going to try and wrap 2 questions together for you. We have Diana asking, which marine biodiversity considerations should we actually be thinking about when we're considering the expansion of offshore wind? And then we have Sebastiano asking about the unintended consequences of offshore wind that we might face in 5, 10, 20 years. So sort of, continuing the train of thought that Deborah started there. Han, I'd love your perspectives on those 2 questions, please.
Thank you. I think that, as Deborah has mentioned, there's different considerations when you think about like fixed bottom offshore wind, right, that make use of the seabed more than floating wind. So in terms of, the fixed bottom offshore wind, there's always a challenge with balancing the use of the ocean in a sustainable manner. Definitely when you put an infrastructure or like a built environment in the seabed, there will be some distractions there. And then there will be also considerations that you need to take into account as the offshore wind also operates, so noise around birds, etc., and then also interaction with marine mammals. But then also taking from what Louis said about regenerating the ecosystem as well, and looking at the global goals for the global biodiversity framework, we need to restore like 30% by 2030. How can you use that as a way to, instead of just like reduce and mitigate the impact, but also restoring the impact? So Deborah also mentioned the fact that some of the offshore wind foundations could be used as, the foundation for marine life to grow. And I think that is really something that we need to promote more often. And I know that there's already a lot of progress in across many offshore wind developers to get nature inclusive design, but also to have like this kind of restoration of marine life on the structure of offshore wind. There is also a combination, for example, between offshore wind and aquaculture, like shellfish or seaweed farming. So some of these can mitigate the biodiversity impact, but also going beyond and trying to kind of restore as well nature in the ocean. the other things in terms of unintended consequences, I really hope that, as we plan the governance process in a smart way and in an inclusive way, we do not face so much with unintended consequences. But of course, offshore wind is growing so rapidly over the past 2 decades. And recently, we have seen more and more decommissioning, but that's still very rare at the moment. We need to think about also when these offshore winds are decommissioned, what would be the governance approach to take, or what would be the considerations to take? So just to see some example, like the recycling of wind turbine blades that are, I think, top of mind for many developers, that there will be a lot of wind turbines that are decommissioned. How can we find a new life for these wind turbines? Is one thing that we can take into consideration. The fact that we also have the structure and marine life will be going on this structure when we decommission the wind turbines, whether we will remove this structure or how are we going to find like some of the solutions to these structures based on the marine life that is already existing there is also another thing to take into consideration. So I think that, all of these, I hope that will be discussed right through an inclusive process so that everyone who get a stakes in the process can contribute their opinions.
Thank you so much, Han. Well, I would like to come back to Deborah in a minute on this really important question around end of life and designing for the end of life from the start. So Deborah, I'll come back to you in a minute, but first of all, I'd like to turn to Louis to pick up another couple of the audience questions. So forgive me, I'm throwing quite difficult questions in packages, but pick up what you can. So Ahmed has asked how we can build governance structures that are able to be responsive in a faster feedback loop and able to detect weak signals and to be more adaptive. So I think that's an interesting question that I've not thought about from a governance angle before. And then we have a also very interesting question from Fernando, who's talking about the ability to really integrate unheard voices into the way that we do the dialogue that informs our governance, and in the process to make sure that we are hearing the voices of vulnerable communities. And Fernando's talking particularly in this context about Latin America and the global south more broadly. And to expand our sense of governance to embrace ancestral wisdom, indigenous knowledge, spirituality, social justice in a more holistic way, I guess. So I'd be interested in your thoughts on that as well, Louis.
Thank you, Ahmed and Fernando, for the questions, and they luckily are interlinked. I think the key here is to think of governance as a practice. Though we meet governance usually in the form of processes, of structures, law, plans, and the lot, in its core, it's a practice, and think of it as a learning practice. A bit earlier, I said open up spaces for dialogue to grow a shared understanding about a practice, growing a shared understanding from co-reflected lived experiences would be, if you went into phenomenological terms, the formula to build a governance of governance, something that guides the practice of governance as an ever-evolving learning practice that, of course, manifests in the description of processes, in the description of structures, in the description of laws and the like. But to embrace that plasticity, that capacity not only to adapt, but also to innovate and continuously improve. And on that, I almost say automatically embrace or invite more and more voices, embrace the diversity that there is. And again, also this kind of invitation is a practice that can be governed, that can follow rules, that can follow a shared understanding, that it becomes the obvious thing to do. So these two connect for me in the focus on governance and how to improve that. So as soon as we go stiff in just addressing structures and processes, we are moving into a more and more fragile situation. And as soon as we think about governance as a practice, as a learning practice, we have all the possibilities in the world to continuously innovate and improve.
Yes, it's interesting. I think we often think of governance as sort of a hardwired set of rules, but really we're talking about it as a dynamic practice. And so that does shift one's thinking. Han, is there anything else you'd like to say on this topic before I turn back to Deborah to come back to a bit of the engineering?
No, thank you.
So Deborah, I'd like to now pick up Nicholas's question, as well as returning to the end of life issues. So Nicholas has asked about how we work out what reasonably practicable means in the terms of the sort of health and safety definition of reducing risk to the point which is, you know, reasonably practicable. And so everything has a price point, and how do we decide in the context of offshore wind where that price point is in terms of the health and safety benefits? So I'll start with that, and then I'll come back to you on end of life.
Well, thank you. I think, you know, as has already been talked about, you know, when you've got a very rapidly growing sector and you've got lots of innovation, and the innovation is in the structures themselves, but also the way they're operated, the way they're supported, and the way they're installed. So we're also seeing innovation in new vessels and new methodologies for transferring people or equipment between vessels and onto platforms. So all of these things, and the other aspect of this, of course, is new technology in terms of use of autonomous vehicles and autonomous systems and robotics offshore, which is one way to remove the people from what can be a dangerous environment, but also has its own hazards and needs for regulation. So I think with all of these fast-moving innovations, then we need to take a pragmatic and a sort of adaptive management type approach and learn from what we do, but also a very open approach to, you know, within the community of working in that sector offshore. And I think this is a typical thing for has been the thing for offshore oil and gas as well, to be very much sharing any safety issues that go ahead that happen, so that people and the sector as a whole can learn as fast as possible from those.
Thank you very much, Deborah. And I'm going to stick with you because I would like to get your reflections on how we can do better at designing for end of life. So Hans already started to paint a picture of why this is important. I'd love to get your view on you know, in practice, what can we do differently that will lead to better whole life outcomes?
Yes. And as Hannah said, then, you know, a lot of those offshore wind farms are approaching the end of their design life. So they will need to be either decommissioned or, if we can take a circular approach, repowered, reused, and so that we can extend their lifetime. So if we can design things for circular economy, then we're going to minimize the amount of material, maximize the lifespan and the reuse of that material, and if possible, design in the opportunity for reuse and reconditioning. So, for example, things like designing structures that can then be disassembled, and the component parts can be potentially remanufactured or repaired so that they can then be reused. And then we can repower some of those turbines coming to the end of their life. The turbine blades is a huge, has always been a sort of huge issue, but there are ways to recycle those blades. There's a huge amount of research going into the area, and we are seeing that beginning to shift. But I think, you know, having, in some cases, it's about requiring this to be put into design standards to address circular design, but also providing methods and solutions for people to follow. And that's where the need for research and the research and innovation comes in to support this fast-moving new sector.
Thank you, Deborah. And it's a topic that the academies continue to do work on, including with international partners, because it is just so important. So, Han, I want to ask you the question from Kim now, please. So Kim's asked how we can ensure that private sector entities can balance profits against the responsible governance considerations that we've been talking about in this sector.
It's a very good question. And I think it really lies at the heart of the challenge ahead, right? I think that we should not take a view it's either climate or nature or it's profit. I think there should be, right, like the commercial viability of a project also depends on the interactions with nature, climate, with local communities. So just taking examples of some projects that face oppositions that will then lead to, cancellations or project delays. These are because they haven't been able to get buy-in from communities in the first place, and that it transfer into economic loss. So what I'm trying to say is like being responsible doesn't mean that you lose out in terms of profits. And I think we should take this kind of holistic integration between, climate, nature, and profit into account. What we also have been seeing as well is, of course, in this current context, as we know, it's very challenging also for developers to get the funding for the projects, meanwhile implementing a number of approaches that are supposed to be responsible. We do understand that, especially in the current geopolitics. So it's also not really just the responsibility of an offshore wind developer to have to balance all of these issues. That's why we're also working a lot with governments, as Louise mentioned, like to change the rules of the game to reward, right, responsible practices in terms of like oceans permitting criteria. We also work with financial institutions to integrate more considerations of nature, climate communities in the way that they will fund different offshore wind projects or invest in built environment projects. So I think that if we take a holistic approach and influencing or reaching out to different actors, we can build systems in which the profitabilities will then respond to broader societal and business value.
Thank you, Han. And yes, there's a strong link between economic sustainability and environmental sustainability that we sometimes forget when we try and talk about those trade-offs. So that was a good reminder. Now, I'm going to try and squeeze in one last question. I'm giving you a heads up, Louis. It's going to be Ivan's question. And then I'm going to come to everybody and ask you for a final takeaway for the audience. The time goes so quickly at these sessions, but we are nearly at time. So Louis, can you give us a quick response to Ivan's question about how we can improve our understanding of complexity theory in terms of our approach to offshore wind governance?
Thank you so very much for the question. We're coming back to the focus on practice, and I think this is sort of the repeating meme here, to really think of practice and to really think of practice of governance and governance of practice as something that informs and forms how we do things. What do we do when we do what we do? How do we do it? And why do we do it? And that all already leans into sort of the takeaways of today. Make space, take time to grow a shared understanding of these kinds of practices and what informs these practices. If we go back to the offshore wind, we can embark on all the existing models of stakeholder involvement and giving or integrating the unheard voices and all the language that we use to describe the field, but really shifting towards, I was earlier leaning into a democratic notion, shifting to a shared ownership of the issue and not making it single ownership. That is probably as a last resonance to the end of life paradigm. And there's so much we can learn from Harry Potter. The goblins were producing things and they owned it for forever. So we have a governance process in place that chops this ownership or hands over the ownership. But think about, just for the thought experiment and an invitation to be innovative and creative about our thinking about this kind of practice. If the producers would own whatever product, whatever installation in offshore and in the grid until the end of its life, it would change the revenue models, Hannah. It would change the ownership and run the responsibility to how do I actually build, how do I engineer the product so that I can have a great ease over the entire lifespan and do something with it at the very end, and reinventing our practice along the sort of more creative thinking, and take the time, make space for this kind of thinking, and this is something where we really have to oppose the efficiency imperative of our practice, and this is where I'd like to end it.
Thank you very much, Louis. I'm going to go straight to Han for your takeaway for the audience.
Yeah, I think for me, really, first of all, thank you for the conversation. I really enjoyed it. I think my takeaway would be really, again, the trust and the collaboration that we work together in this complex governance systems. I think it's not about us versus them. Sometimes you think, oh, it's business, so it must be just profitability. Or if you're from an NGO, that means that you are talking about, like environmental standards, etc. I've met many people who work in both sectors who are talking at the same voice. So I think it's really about, trust and collaboration across sectors and across perspective.
Great message, Han. I'm going to give you the last word on this, Deborah. What would you like the audience to take away?
Okay, well, I think, a system approach, working across disciplines, being inclusive, encouraging more voices into the room, because in the end, this is for all of us, and we all have a role to play in this, to achieve energy transition. It's not just the engineers or the governance part, it's everybody. So we also have a role to explain, understand, and learn from others.
Fantastic. Thank you, Deborah. And thank you to all of our panelists for a very interesting and stimulating and lively discussion. We've travelled from Harry Potter to fishing quotas with lots of interesting stops along the way. And I think you've left us with a really optimistic reminder that actually, governance is a great enabler, and that we can approach it as a way to optimize the way we do things, our practice, as Louis called it, to deliver the best possible outcomes for all of us over timescales that are meaningful. So that's been a really, really great note to end on. And I thank all of our audiences for very, very challenging questions. It always makes me happy when we get questions that have to make us all think very hard. So thank you so much for your engagement. If this conversation has sparked your interest, you've got any further comments about today's event, please do respond to the survey that's been posted into the chat, and will also be emailed to you following the event, because your feedback helps us to make sure that we continue to improve our programme, and you'll see that reflected in future events. But for now, thank you so much to our panellists and to our audience for joining, and look forward to seeing you all at an Academy event before too long. Thank you so much for joining.